I've been interested in lighthouse illumination for a long time because it seemed to me that an awful lot of work has been written on the towers and the civil engineering and the drama of the construction, and also on, you know, the social history of the lighthouse keepers and, you know, their drunkenness, their suicide. They had a very high rate of drunkenness and suicide, a lot of work done on that, their poor, sad wives and children, etc. And it seemed to me when I embarked on this, not nearly enough had been looked at the reason for the towers being there, which are, of course, the light sources. So I got going on originally on the Fresnel lens, and then when I started reading for a PhD, I thought I'd go back a bit and see if I could put that into content. And before you could say knife, I became completely hooked on the Reflector story, which is a whole lot more interesting than you might think. And then, because various other, I've then gotten a bit of a role about sort of correcting myths and things like that. And it became perfectly clear to me that the Stevensons, Thomas Smith, actually, Stevenson's stepfather, employee, and father-in-law, they started this myth making right from the beginning. So that's really what I'm hoping to tell. I hope you'll agree with me, because actually it is all rock solid stuff sitting in the archives. And it just, but anyway, you don't have to. I'd love to be shot down. So let's have a look at the background very quickly. So in the bad old days, pre what you might call scientific systems, you had fires. That's a very, very nice description by David Stevenson of the hopelessly inadequate fire on the old Isle of May lighthouse. So its appearance was very varying, now shooting up in high flames, again enveloped in dense smoke and never well seen when most required. Very good description. And then you get Smeaton in the Edgestone, and he's got 24 candles in a 2-tier chandelier. And he writes in the Edgestone book that standing with a telescope on Plymouth Hoe, he could see the candles burning 9 miles off. Well, bear in mind, there is, of course, no light pollution. And I expect he could see a faint glimmer, but none of this was actually very satisfactory. And although it's extraordinary that the story of William Hutchinson has been so undervalued, in fact, this is the moment that what we might call science enters the story of lighthouse illumination. William Hutchinson was the dockmaster in Liverpool, and apparently he was a privateer, various lurid stories about him, but we don't mind about that because we're really only interested in his lighthouse story. And it was William Hutchinson, and I don't know how he came to this. William Hutchinson pioneered the use of the parabolic reflector in Britain. And the point about a parabola is that when you set the lamp at the proper focal point, it projects a parallel beam of light as against all the kind of, you know, light going all over the place with fires and candles. And in order to increase the reflection, he lined his reflector with facets of mirrored glass. There had earlier been metal reflectors, but they were spheres, or they were just flat plates. This is the first time that they used a parabolic cone was used. And he lined it with metal plates rather than just polishing it. There were, of course, problems because they all were, when they were using lamps at all, using very crude lamps with using whale or seal oil, which in fact was basically boiled up blubber, smelt disgusting and smoked like anything. And so the reflectors very quickly got sooted up, which is why, in fact, Hutchinson, can you see if I move my mouse around? Anyway, as you can see, the burner is 14 inches long and very narrow with these with wicks here, and then the tube is very long and the oil is drawn into it. It is not, of course, in the correct focal point of the parabola. but it prevented sooting and was a whole lot better than almost anything else, at the time. So he, in fact, was building lighthouses on the Mersey. And there is, the first one is Leaso at 1760, 1763, Hoylake and Bidston. And you can see the varying sizes of the reflectors. Actually, Robert Stevenson in the early 19th century went to see these. It took me ages because in the notebook, he miswrites Hoylake as Alec. So I ran all over the place looking for Alec until it finally dawned that what he meant was Hoylake. So they were very well known. They lit the Mersey and they carried on for really quite a long time. Well, Hutchinson was known to the shipping fraternity and also to some extent to the lighthouse fraternity, as you will see. But the person who is really important in the Scottish story is Ezekiel Walker. Ezekiel Walker is a sort of unknown figure. Somebody wrote a fantastic paper on him in about 2013. He was a natural philosopher and he was a mechanic of King's Lynn, which is, of course, 1 million miles from any known centre of civilization, or it was then. And actually, he first came to attention with his putting in the light at Hunstanton in 1777. And the patentee, the owner of the lighthouse, commissioned Ezekiel Walker to rebuild the tower and light it. And what he did was to come up with 18 parabolic reflectors arranged in tiers, lined with some teeny weeny pieces of mirror glass, each less than an inch square. And each of these 18 reflectors had a lamp using 10 single threads of cotton, but they were placed at the correct focal point, but they sooted up. So that if you were a lighthouse keeper, you spent your entire time with a rag getting rid of the soot. And there are lots of nice descriptions of it, but anyway, somebody at the time wrote each of the 18 cones reflected the same, each of the 18 cones reflecting the same amount of light would show like a star 18 times as intense. So a whole lot better than candles, lamps, and fires. Interestingly, and this is a whole different story that would require another whole seminar, Everard Walker and Ezekiel Walker was consulted by Trinity House, but actually they go off in a completely different direction and design a completely different kind of reflector, but that's another story. So we get to Scotland, and as you will all know because you live there, it's got a highly indented coastline, and into the 1780s there were almost no lighthouses. Robert Stevenson says that actually there were only 2 purpose-built towers, the Isle of May that we've just had a picture of, and Little Cymru Light in the Isle in the Firth of Clyde. Though one has to assume that there were presumably swape lights and church towers. But anyway, all pretty inadequate. And of course, Trinity House in England is going great guns by this point. And, you know, and a lot of work is being done on lighthouses in England. And finally, they wake up in Scotland and they realize that, you know, something's got to be done. And in 1786, the commissioners for Northern Lighthouses were established. I'll call them the NLC as we go along. The Lord Provost of Edinburgh was chair, and there were incredibly high-profile trustees from all over Scotland. They got an Act of Parliament, and it was decided that they would build 4 lighthouses: Kinnaird Castle, Mull of Kintyre, I don't know how you pronounce it, Eileen Glass on Harris, and North Ronaldsay. So basically, one on the Aberdeen coast, one in the Orkney Islands, one on the Harris Islands, one on the Mull of Kintyre. And they get information. I mean, they're actually very responsible, these rather high-powered people on the board. And they wrote, as they say, to several places relative to the best construction of lighthouses. And they also write to Liverpool, and William Hutchinson sends them his book. Mostly it's about lee shores and sailing and etc. But there is this absolutely crucial chapter in it on illuminating lighthouses, which is where we get all the information about his own lighthouses from. So he sends them the book, which gives them some idea of what he's talking about. And various other people send various ideas in, including Thomas Smith, who is, as you know, Robert Stevenson's employee, father-in-law and stepfather. And Thomas Smith is described as a tin plate worker or white iron smith. And he sends an unsolicited set of designs to them called Observations on Lighthouses by Reflectors with a Small Model. So they get all this stuff and they write back to Hutchinson, and Hutchinson, interestingly, says they absolutely have to go and consult Ezekiel Walker in a Hunstanton. And I don't know why Hutchinson doesn't himself take it on. I expect he's too busy being the dockmaster of Liverpool. And the connection between him and Ezekiel Walker is interesting, and I haven't managed to untangle it. Anyway, Hutchinson recommends powerfully that they consult Ezekiel Walker. And in 1786, the commissioners write to Walker, informing him of the situation of the 4 intended lighthouses and requesting his opinion fully on the subject, with directions as to the best construction, and whether he would come to undertake the erection of them or oversee the execution, and on what terms. And Walker offers to build them 1 lighthouse and give directions to them for the other 3, or for 50 guineas would instruct any person the trustees thought proper to send in the whole of his principles and improvement. Sorry, I'll get that again. For 50 guineas would instruct any person the trustees thought proper to send in the whole of his principles and improvements. And in the same minute, they note that Thomas Smith had made proposals for constructing the lighthouses by lamps and reflectors, had made several experiments for that purpose, and laid models before the trustees, which, on account of his want of experience, has not hitherto been agreed to. Therefore, and in order that no assistance may be wanted for having these lighthouses constructed in the most complete manner, it was resolved that Mr. Smith be sent to King's Lynn to Mr. Walker to be instructed by him. And on the 22nd of January in 1787, you must remember this date for later on the 22nd of January 1787, John Grieve, who's the chairman of the NLC and the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, writes to Ezekiel Walker and says, in consequence of your letters and opinion, the trustees appointed by Act of Parliament for erecting 4 lighthouses have resolved to have them constructed and lighted agreeable to your principles. And then in March of 1787, they send various letters round to the landowners and them, etc., for where the lighthouse is going to be built, informing them of the plan for lamps and reflectors proposed by Mr. Walker. And also in March, the commissioners then get letters received from Mr. Walker and Mr. Smith, informing of Mr. Smith's now being fully instructed in the whole principles of constructing lighthouses by lamps and reflectors. Well, you have to remember that Smith was a tinsmith. He's making lamps, domestic articles such as fenders and brass fittings and what have you. The lamps are, of course, important, but he is not a civil engineer, and he's working in brass and copper, and it is perfectly clear that, having a reflector is a good idea. It's also unlikely, I think, that he knew either of Hutchinson or Walker, and his reflector and the reflectors that he used to show them was would have been of polished tin. And although I've needless to say, got lots of pictures of things, you know, of lamps being reflected. You know, it might have been something like this, or it might have been, or something like that. That's a carriage lamp with a reflector behind it, but something of the kind, polished tin. There's nothing to say that it was parabolic, and absolutely nothing to say that, as was about to happen, it was going to be lined with mirror glass. And that, although all the what reflectors there are, also, this is the museum in Edinburgh, they all say this was made by Thomas Smith. Actually, my powerful contention is that no, it wasn't. Actually, it was designed by Ezekiel Walker, and in fact, Smith was taken on by the Northern Lighthouse Commission as to oversee, having learned from Walker, to oversee the construction of these things by the Caron Company. What's quite interesting, if you look at this, if you think back to 1777, the original reflectors on the Hunstanton Life, the bits of glass were only an inch square, but in fact, Walker wrote to Trinity House when he was trying to get that job and said, I'm continuing to experiment and I've got a very perfected version of my reflector. And he describes in quite a lot of detail. And I think one of the things he must have been doing is, in fact, increasing the sizes of the glass and making them of a completely different form. And I like to think that these big Scottish reflectors really are his perfected design. Anyway, so Smith comes back to Edinburgh, supplied with all this information, and he, as I said, he supplies the specifications to the Caron Company. He orders the mirror glass from Glasgow, and he is instructed to oversee the fabrication. And of course, he is not a civil engineer, so all he's doing at this point, all he is doing is, in fact, making sure that the reflectors and the lamps get built. And they employ Robert Kay, who's the architect, to design the lighthouses. So, as you again will all know, the Kinnaird Castle Lighthouse was the first of the four, and it had 17 reflectors, each with a ventilator tube running up to a hole in the centre of the lantern roof. And then the other three followed. I think I want to go back one slide, because what I failed to point out, I wrote it in, is that in fact there is this ventilator tube to carry off the smoke of the lamp, because we are up with the same old problem that all lighthouses faced at this time, is that the lamps smoke like hell. And, you know, and very quickly, the reflecting properties of your parabola just, you know, they were covered in black smoke. Anyway, so Robert Kay at this point designs the lighthouses, and perhaps I also ought to say, because of my later story, is that Robert Stevenson was employed by Thomas Smith in 1786 or 87, so right at the beginning of the lighthouse work. Anyway, Ezekiel Walker, having done his stuff and being paid his 50 guineas, goes, you know, disappears from view, and Smith, you know, employing Robert Stevenson, go on to build about 13 more lighthouses. And of course, Robert Stevenson is a civil engineer, so after a while, they both do the building and the lighting. And there are about 13 more lighthouses built up to about 1797 using this new lighting system. Well, at the time, all the contemporary newspaper articles say that Ezekiel Walker is responsible for the design of these lighting systems. And it was quite well recognized. But in 1801, this article appears in the supplement of the 3rd edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. This ingenious and modest man, that is Thomas Smith, seems to have conceived the idea of illuminating lighthouses by means of lamps and reflectors instead of coal fires, without knowing that something of the same kind had long been used in France. He has therefore all the merit of an inventor. Well, you could say, apart from the fact that it's dead wrong, as you'll see in a minute, interesting without knowing that something of the kind had long been used in France. In fact, the French did indeed come up with the solution to all lighthouse illumination until the Fresnel lens, which was the big silvered copper parabolic reflector using an argand lamp which was smokeless, and it was first demonstrated in 1788 and first installed in 1790 at Cordoue, so that actually, you know, in 1786, Thomas Smith wouldn't have known anything of the kind. And David Brewster claims that the entire article for the reflectors for a lighthouse was actually written by Thomas Smith himself or a friend to whom he had communicated his invention and method. So if this is true, and David Brewster, of course, knew them very well, if this is true, it's Thomas Smith who is starting to rewrite the history of the Stevenson dynasty. Anyway, Walker goes mad, as you might expect, and he writes to the monthly magazine claiming primacy, and he reproduces his appointment by the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, which was written on the 22nd of January 1787, and it's printed in full in the article in the monthly magazine. Well, the error is then corrected in the 4th, 5th, and 6th editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The last edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica is actually 1823. And a year after the 6th edition of 1823, Robert Stevenson produces his great book on the Bell Rock Lighthouse, in which you will all remember that Rennie was written out. And this is the top. I'm afraid I couldn't think of an easier way of doing this. The stuff in red, the top one, is in fact the first minute of the Northern Lighthouse Commission. It says the Precies, the chairman president, informed he'd written to several places relative to the best construction of lighthouses and other particulars relative to them. He'd received from a gentleman in Liverpool a chart of the harbour and 4 lighthouses with answers to a variety of queries. Well, if you look down below, that is the introduction to the Bell Rock Lighthouse book, which says the Precies informed the meeting that he'd corresponded with persons most likely to afford information relative to the best construction of lighthouses, had received answers from Liverpool to a variety of queries regarding lighthouses. That, it seems to me, is Robert Stevenson rewriting the first bit of the minute. It's perfectly clear he must have seen it. And then then a bit further down, you get that he, the president, had received from Thomas Smith observations on lighthouses by reflectors with a small model. So Robert Stevenson says, in particular, he had received from the late Mr. Thomas Smith of Edinburgh plans and observations on the construction of lighthouses with lamps and reflectors, which, having been ultimately approved of, Mr. Smith was nominated engineer to the board. Well, in my view, that is lies. And it's fun when you come across something that's quite as blatant as this, it seems to me. And as you've just heard, in fact, Thomas Smith was not nominated engineer to the board. Far from it. And interestingly, Robert Stevenson goes on, continues to promulgate this myth. So in 1834, on the Select Committee of Lighthouses, he gives evidence and says, the reflectors first used in the northern lighthouses were formed to the parabolic curve, introduced and ingeniously constructed by the late Mr. Thomas Smith. Well, yes, possibly. And what's really interesting is that if you actually go and look at the actual minutes on this minute of the 22nd of January 1787, when in fact Ezekiel Walker has been employed to design these things, there is a penciled note saying "Eng" against that minute. And a lot of people have taken that to mean that that was the moment that Thomas Stevenson was appointed engineer, when in fact, of course, he wasn't. So when you read on, it is perfectly clear from the minutes that actually he was a contractor originally. He was paid on account, and he wasn't actually referred to by the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners as engineer till 1788, and he wasn't paid a regular salary as their engineer until 1794, which isn't to say that he wasn't, you know, developing the reflectors as he goes along, and he is also trying to develop lamps as he went along, because they built enough, and each lighthouse, you know, would have been a different situation. Each of the reflectors would have, you know, been of different sizes, and I'm sure because he was an ingenious man, I mean, don't let's totally demolish his reputation, because he was a good engineer, a good mechanical engineer, a good lamp engineer, I'm sure he went on to make modifications, which you would do. I think you wouldn't just stick. But basically, the model is, of course, Ezekiel Walker. Well, I don't know how I'm doing for time, not too badly. My last little section, I've entitled it Drawbacks and Ironies. Although the faceted mirrored reflectors were much, much better than earlier forms of lighting, they actually caused quite a lot of problems. One of the things is that if you're using bits of glass, even if they're quite big bits of glass, it's difficult to form perfectly curved reflecting surfaces with bits of glass, using these bits of glass, so that in fact your reflected beam is probably not as powerful as you might like. The joints between the glass segments get dirty, and bits of glass get dislodged with the cleaning, so the keepers all had to keep supplies of glass putty and paint. And in fact, Robert Stevenson, you know, sends the keepers endless instructions about how to keep these things clean and efficient, and, you know, in order to maintain the beam. But of course, the major problem right from the beginning with any kind of lighthouse lamp, but especially ones using reflectors, is this problem with the sooting. In fact, the early lamps for the first 4 lighthouses used cruises, which are really crude lamps. Then they soot, they smoke, you know. It was endemic right across the lighthouse world. So they were certainly, but even so, despite the sooting, they were certainly, as I say, much better than what had gone before. But the first one was lit in the Kinnaird Head in 1787, and actually, by the time Stevenson and by the time Smith put them in, they were about to become obsolete because of what he says in 1801 about the French. They were about to become obsolete because the French, they'd in fact been using weird kind of hopelessly inefficient sort of spherical sort of reflectors in bits, which is another story, designed by somebody called Tourtis Saint-Crin. But they decided that they were going to have a parabolic reflector, and that the parabolic reflector was going to be of silvered copper, so that you get a proper reflecting surface. But the absolutely crucial point about it is that they used the smokeless argand lamp which had been developed by Argand in about 1780, and completely got rid of your smoking problem. There was, in fact, there was a double wick, there was, the combustion, but it burned off. I should have written a whole lot of notes about the Argand lamp, but take it from me, they were smokeless. Very, very, very clever piece of construction, and completely transformed lighting, not only lighthouse lighting across the world. And at the same time, you also they begin to use spermaceti oil, which comes from the sperm whale and is very sweet. It smells nice. You hardly need to refine it. And of course, for Scotland, what's really interesting is it doesn't freeze up in the winter, because another of the problems with the early lights is that, in fact, you had to keep a boiler going. You actually had to keep the oil warmed and heated, because otherwise it would freeze in the winter. So the French developed this form of illumination, incredibly effective, and it was known as the catoptric system. And so I say it was first used in Cordovan in 1790. And that rather beautiful object, it's revolving, is a part of what was used for Cordovan in 1790. This is the French Lighthouse Museum, which is an hour and a half by boat off the west coast of Brittany. And the museum's only open on the third Thursday after the full moon. I mean, it's really difficult to get access to, but when you get there, it is stuffed with all the early scientific lighting stuff that transformed lighthouse illumination. Interestingly, of course, Hutchinson, who's very good at all this kind of thing, he produces a second edition of his treatise on seamanship in 1787, in which he actually describes the Argand lamp, and he's in fact instrumental in introducing it into England. And of course, the English start doing it, so that in fact, Trinity House go off and see all this stuff, and they come back and they, in fact, design a catoptric system. And the first English lighthouse was, in fact, St Agnes in Scilly, which was lit in May 1790. I mean, what's quite interesting is that Thomas Smith absolutely persists in using mirrored glass reflectors until 1801. And finally, Robert Stevenson persuaded him to start manufacturing silvered copper reflectors and to use Argand lamps. So although Smith had been apparently endlessly designing new lamps, there was no point in doing it, because all lamps smoked, however much you did with ventilation and this, that, and the other. So the combination of the Argand lamp and the big silvered copper parabolic reflector, as introduced by France in 1790, was actually the way to go. And the first Scottish lighthouse lit with a new catoptric apparatus is the Isle of Inchiquay's lighthouse. Well, having said that, effectively, Smith and Robert Stevenson completely rewrote their history. They were, of course, despite what I would describe as a sort of murky beginning, they were, of course, Robert Stevenson in particular. I'm not that clear about Thomas Smith, but Robert Stevenson was, of course, a brilliant lighthouse engineer, and Alan and Thomas, his sons, went on to make a major contribution working with Leonor Fresnel to the development of the Fresnel lens. But the sort of irony is that, of course, the Northern Lighthouse Commission they were the in-house engineers. That's what they did. And they were so good, and they maintained the catoptric light, i.e. the ones with the silver copper reflectors and the Argand lamps. They maintained them so well and so perfectly that actually, although they introduced the first Fresnel lenses into Scotland in about 1734, 4 or 5, I've got the date but can't immediately remember it. Actually, the Fresnel lens was very expensive, etc., and they couldn't see, at the Northern Lighthouse Commission, could not see why they couldn't go on with reflectors, which actually were great, were perfectly good. And, you know, it was a well-tried system. Interestingly, Trinity House did not have an in-house engineer until James Nicholas Douglas, until the 1860s. So, in a sense, the Stevensons were fabulously efficient. They didn't feel that you had to expend millions and change all this into Fresnel lenses, because actually their reflector system worked brilliantly. But when finally the moment came and the reflector system began to be eased out, Allen and Thomas, working with James Timmins Chance, were absolutely crucial to the development of the Fresnel lens, which I'm rather keen on Allen and Thomas, so I think they rather make up for the shortcomings of their father and their grandfather, but call me stuffy and difficult. So that's really sort of it. It is just, I'm just fascinated that the myth of Thomas Smith being the engineer for the Northern Lighthouse Commission, and he was utterly wonderful in every possible way, and that the Stevensons had it all wrapped up, is actually, in my view, totally untrue. So I'm exploding a little myth. So I think that's about all I've got to say. Now what do I do?